Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. A very warm welcome to this webinar. This is the webinar series on greening transportation projects that is being organized by ADB in partnership with the Wildlife Institute of India. My name is Karma Yangzom. I'm the Principal Environment Specialist in the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department of ADB, and I will be moderating the webinar today. So today's webinar is the third in a series of 4 webinars. We already had 2 last year in November and December. And this is a quick overview on the 4 webinars. We will have the last and the 4th one coming up on 10th February. So if you could please go back to the previous slide, Victor. So today's webinar, the title of today's webinar, which is a rather long one, is on natural capital conservation amidst development and the role of governance in planning friendly and sustainable transportation projects. So we will be touching upon natural capital a lot today. And today we have 2 speakers. We have 2 ladies. We will first have Dr. Asha. She used to be in the Wildlife Institute of India before, and she is still very much an expert and very active in this field. So we are very glad to have her today. And then followed by Dr. Asha, we will have Elizabeth Fairbank. We can call her Liz. She's the program officer in the Corridors and Crossings program in the Center for Large Landscape Conservation based in Montana in the US. So Dr. Asha will begin with her presentation. She will talk about the broader concepts on the topic, and then we will take 1 or 2 questions after Dr. Asha's presentation, and then this will be followed by Liz. Liz will provide some examples and case studies from the US and talk to us about the situation and strategies in the US. And then after that, we will have more time for question and answers. So while the speakers are presenting, I invite our participants to please go ahead and put your questions or comments in the chat box, and we will pick it up later during the Q&A session. And we had a few housekeeping announcements. So I hope this is okay. As normal, we are going to be recording this webinar. Please make sure to have your mic on mute and only unless you're speaking. And if you have a question, you can either put your question in the chat box, or you're also welcome to please raise your hand and I will invite you to speak and ask your question. So I think without any further delay, since we'll have a lot of interesting points to discuss today, we should just get right on with the webinar. And I would now like to invite Dr. Asha to deliver her presentation. Dr. Asha, over to you, please.
Thank you, Karma. Well, let me just share my slides and then we can be in a... Okay. So are the slides there now?
They are flying in slowly. Yeah. Okay, if you can please put it on the full screen mode. Perfect.
Okay. A very good morning to all of you and a very happy new year. And thank you, Karma, for giving me this opportunity to speak today. Well, before I start, I would like your attention to this picture, which itself speaks for itself. And here, what it actually shows is that we are at a stage where we see a lot of challenges and opportunities emerging together for the development sector. We have these different linear infrastructures etched on the landscape. And when we talk about these transportation arteries, they mean that people are getting connected, the commerce is promoted, and the pulse of the society is being maintained. But at the same time, as they intensify, and they will intensify, with the projected figures of the growth in the total number of kilometers by 2050, we know with these intensifications, we are also intensifying the fragmentation of the habitats and impoverishment of nature. Sorry?
Please mute your mic. We can hear a gentleman speaking in one of the dialects of India.
So I thought, let me first put down some founding thoughts to start with, so that we have better ways of taking this topic forward. And among these founding thoughts, I think we are all aware of the fact that we are referring to natural capital, which implies an extension of the economic of capital, and it includes goods and services. Now, this means we are talking about the portfolio of natural assets, which we have inherited, and we want these to be available for future generations so that the developments are sustained. We are also very aware that pressures on capital, particularly as we talk about the natural aspects, the ecosystem services, they're already growing. These are being intensifying on a very, very urgent basis. We have this information flowing in from different quarters. So we are well aware about this. And because of this, the consequences are so grave that we are hardly able to capture all of the attention that this particular aspect deserves. So we have our natural environments getting compromised. We are over-consuming some of the assets, and we are under-investing in those natural assets that are needed. So that is the reason why natural capital thinking is becoming a priority. And this priority is because we want a thinking response to address the issues related to decline of ecosystem benefits from nature. And this becomes more important because we see if we invest in nature, we also enhance the delivery of provisions from the infrastructure services. And we know that policy support and mainstreaming frameworks are needed for better planning of transportation structures, so that while these are being planned, we are also enhancing the benefits from nature for society. Okay, now the good part is that we have learned from examples. We have had bleak prophecies about the decline of natural assets. And these prophecies were further taken as a form of convictions when we got reports from MEA, which said that the natural capital is declining. Now we have reports from IBIS on the global assessment, which again says that we're losing on this. Now with this, it would have been very shameful for us to have these figures and not work on it. So business as usual aspect or business as usual approach has to be forgotten, and we need to move forward to see that how we can approach better the problem and address these issues through good frameworks, through effective efforts by all. And we see now these efforts are being galvanized by the conservation community, the economists, the ecologists, to see that we move up, and by 2050, we don't see the decline, but we see a constant improvement in the capitals that we are talking about, the natural capital. We are not so worried about the societal capitals or the economic capitals or the human capital, because these are being well accounted and they're visible. It is the problem with this natural capital, which is not so visible. But I'm happy to share that with this effort of galvanizing, many of the world leaders in economics and ecologists have come together and have produced numerous resources that are valued, that point us to the need of putting up frameworks. They have provided assessments of the present day conditions of the natural capital and how we can get these integrated into different kind of models, policies, and also in practice. Now, the natural capital approach that we're referring to, it's basically doing what? It's telling us that what we have in our stock and what flows from these stocks in terms of services and benefits to society. And these are so well illustrated in the common parlance, in the lexicons that economists are using, that we fully understand that natural capital, if there are more, then we talk about more benefits and more opportunities for people to thrive, and we have a better well-being. Now, expanding that same logic to the road sector and looking at how natural capital and economic development can be harmonized, we must first understand that roads depend on ecosystem services. Many of these services help build up sustainable road projects or rail projects or other linear infrastructure projects. And at the same time, they also bring in their footprint on nature. So we have a situation where we first must understand what of these services become priority services for us to protect and how they are relevant to roads. Now, if you look at vegetation alone as an asset and the services it renders in different ways to see that we have sustainable roads, we talk about floods, regulation, coastal regulation, storm erosion, landslides, all these are dependent on the services provided by vegetation in terms of stabilization of soils or the coastal areas, or in terms of reducing the sediment load. So these services are very well established that yes, if we have nature around, if we have vegetation around, and if we are conscious of its restoration, whenever roads come up, we know that there are a lot of disturbances physically on the ground. But if these are quickly restored, then we take care of restoring these services. Now, all of these services that we have talked about fall in 4 broad categories about which we have known. We studied these in our college books. We have learned about these from historical perspectives and concepts which come from ecosystem service groups that are working. And the earliest among these have been Constanza. And then we have this Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which clearly defined these 4 different kind of categories for services. And then IBIS, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, said, well, let's all put them together as nature's benefits. But these services, these categories are very well recognized. Now, I would like to take you to another form of categories which are now emerging. So these are definitely there, the provisioning services, the regulating services, the cultural services, but instead of supporting services, now the greater reference is coming to as addressing them as habitat services. And these represent the critical role the habitat plays in species interactions and regulation of population dynamics, the kind of role it plays in providing shelter and food. So these are becoming more prominently known by the name habitat services. And Teep's work was the first one to bring this reference of this term as habitat services. And then following this, we have other people who have also categorized these services and have upfront called them as habitat services, and habitat functions is what they've referred to as being something which is most important. Then there are other groups which are working and they have referred it to habitat or supporting services. So by putting this here, what I'm trying to say now, there's a greater onus on us to understand and appreciate that here we're talking about habitat services, and what we actually mean in business is to actually address all impacts that affect habitat services. Now, from the conservation community's point, I must say that we have always addressed what is more obvious and visible threats of transportation sector on habitats and wildlife. And we have these horror stories from all over. We have seen them in publications, we have seen them in media, and well, these are most studied. So whether we talk about fragmentation, mortality, we talk about barrier impact, we have a fairly good idea about these. But now I'll take you and draw your attention to one of the aspects of habitat services or habitat's role, which has not been realized so well. And here I'm referring to the road verges. These are unrealized and recognized in their role in the planning of transportation projects. And I say this with conviction because I've been a part of assessment of many road sector and rail sector projects where the road verges have not been talked about. Now, for friends who may not be very familiar with the term road verge, I would just like to very quickly mention that it's an area, it's a linear stretch actually which is adjacent to the road. And this strip is distinct in terms of its landscape value as compared to the roadway. And the picture in the background clearly illustrates that we are talking about this area just adjacent to the road. Now it has many functions. It's a very valuable piece of land which is there just next to the road to act as a stepping stone or provide refuges to animals which are moving across from one side to another. It helps provide dispersal to species which are shy and which need an ambush. So these are well studied from the ecological perspective, but they have never featured as a main component in assessment of the value that they command in terms of transportation sector's impacts. Now, I draw here an example from our own research and our own outputs, which were delivered in terms of what decisions can make a difference and how decisions can make a difference. And I draw your attention to one of the examples of the National Highway 7, as it was earlier known, and this runs along the Painch Tiger Reserve. Now it passes through different sections of Madhya Pradesh state and Maharashtra state. And as you would see that the road section here, green, black, light green and dark, they fall in different land use components. So we have a private land, we have the forest land, and we have the areas which are adjoining the protected areas. Now, when this road was studied in a research project where we tried understanding what are the ecological impacts of a road crossing through a tiger reserve, we realized that we have a lot of information on the value of verges. These are being extensively used by animals in different seasons. And this gave us a complete conviction that road verges will have to be maintained whenever we talk about road development projects. Now, in India, whenever road development comes in, any proposal that comes in, then there's an act of parliament, Forest Conservation Act, under which permission is sought for diversion of forest for a non-forestry purpose, like the road building. So the proposal was put up to seek for the permission for grant of diversion for this road building. And the initial proposal said that we need 60 meters wide area for road construction. Now, when we talk about road, there's a linear road stretch, the cemented, the tar area, and then you have a median, which has a standard width, because the protocol suggests that if you have a 30-meter wide road, then you have to have a median of 4.5 meters. And keeping this in mind, the authorities which wanted to construct this road put up a request for 60 meters, assuming that there would be part verge and part forest area next to the road. So the road, the verge, the median, they together form a complete, the complete area which requires diversion. Now, at the same time, the country is very judicious about how much area should be diverted. And there is always a caution that if you could minimize the area that is needed, because many times people ask for more area when they actually need less of it. So when this proposal came for a review, if you could reduce the load if you could reduce the area that is needed for road, then these planners, these engineers thought that, okay, it probably would be simple. And what we can do is ask for 30 meters of road, and we can ask for 30 meters of forest on each side. Now, what happened in such a situation? They realized that we can do with the lesser area if we don't have the verge. So this came as a perspective from the engineering group, which didn't realize the verge importance, the value of verge. They didn't realize that animals need this space, as you would see this in the figure here, that they need this area for making decisions to get onto the road. So in the plain thinking, the verge area was sacrificed. And I want to remind that this should not happen, and we should be conscious about it. So when it came for observation, we said we cannot have this situation. We have to reprioritize your area and see that you allow for verge space. Okay, now let me further take you to a figure that illustrates the value of verges. And thank you, Shamishta, for putting up this graphic for us. Now, if you look at roads, wherever they are, you will see that they're aligned partly through urban areas, partly through agriculture areas, and partly through natural areas. So a stretch runs through these different land uses, and these stretches have verges. These verges provide very useful values in each of these different areas in a different way. So in a wildlife area or a natural area, their importance is more as for serving as corridor or refuge areas for animals. And also the verges have a different set of elements as compared to the deeper forest or the adjacent ecosystem. So there would be grasses, there would be shrubs, there would be trees. So they render a different kind of a diversity, which is valuable for animals which use verges. These could be pollinators, there would be predators, which then find their way to the agricultural land. And these verges also act as carbon sink. And in the urban area, these also help regulate climate, protect from floods, and add to the aesthetic values, well-being, because when you have pedestrians and others using these areas, so it gives a great joy, greater level of joy when you ride. So the cultural values, the aesthetics, and the satisfaction comes from these. So now, again, I'm drawing attention to the fact that these values have to be better recognized, and we must have means and opportunity to address these in all kind of development projects that we talk about in the transportation sector. Now, there's all this work related to verges very, very recent. This has come in last 2-3 years. And here is an important work which was done in Czechoslovakia, where people recognized the value of verges. They also talked about the definite impacts that the road have on verges, and commanded a study where they said that we will take up certain sections and see what's happening there. And this formed the major piece, the foundation for establishing the mitigation principles for verges. And in European and other countries, these are being mowed regularly. So they have talked about, it's not just the aesthetics of the road verges which has to be maintained, but for enhancing their ecosystem services, you have to have a regime of their mowing. So this realization is there, and then we have to look at, in the context of different projects that we're dealing with, that how road verges have to be maintained to enhance the ecosystem benefits that are attached to it. Having said that, now I'm drawing your attention to the fact that this information is all available to us. Now we understand what natural capital is, how we need to maximize this flow of services from the natural capital, and how this has to be mainstreamed in transportation sector so that the developments are acceptable and sustainable. Now, if we look at the natural capital's role in SDGs, it's very, very clearly evident that the natural capital is perhaps there in every single SDG goal that we are aware about. Now, it's not the sustainable development goals which will shape up the sustainable transport, but it's the other way around. The sustainable transport has to see that we are able to achieve the sustainable goals, sustainable development goals by our actions, by our projects. So sustainability should therefore be embedded in all stages of the life cycle of infrastructure related to transport. This would be at the planning stage, this would be at the construction stage, and at the operation stage. So now what we are trying to say, this can only happen if we all understand, if we are convinced that there is a need to mainstream natural capital in the transportation sector's development. And for this, we definitely need government's support. So government should lead the development and coordinate long-term program of investments in this capital. And what it means, we are aware that in India, we have a state of environment reports, we have the biodiversity reports, we have the register of biodiversity. So on the same lines, we should be talking about a state of natural capital report, and we should be talking about the register of natural capitals. And then the government should develop credible ecosystem approaches to support and fulfill the goals of development and conservation together. Now, the priorities are not just with the government. What government has to do is, yes, the decision-making body of the government will remain that, but then these responsibilities have to be shared between the private sector, the public sector, the policymakers, the researchers, and anybody who could contribute to enhance an understanding of what needs to be done to see that ecosystem services become visible as a parameter in the assessments. The donor agencies should establish lending principles for infrastructure and so that the natural capital is maintained. And I'm aware that ADB already has safeguards where you're talking about the principles and what aspects need to be considered. And I think road verges and other ignored areas should then become part of these principles. And we cannot achieve this unless we have good assessment and accounting frameworks, so that the decisions are then based on these outcomes of these integrated frameworks. Now, one of such framework is the National Accounting of Ecosystem Services, Natural Capital Accounting and Valuation of Ecosystem Services, NCAVS as it is called. It is already there. It started in 2017. It flows from the world's recognized standard of environmental economic accounting, which started in 2012. And this CAVES has now progressed in different countries, Brazil, China, India, Mexico, and South Africa. And I'm very happy to share that India has been able to put up its final report on this aspect, which is the accounting framework. It is well recognized. It talks about different conditions of ecosystems, services that are provided by these, and what kind of benefits. So you have the physical, in physical terms, the report defines all these, and then there are steps in monetary terms which are fulfilled. And so we have a fairly good idea about the accounting of biodiversity based on this report. This report is available. Anybody could download it, and you will understand and appreciate that the focus of the report is on how to mainstream biodiversity and ecosystems into policy through capital accounts. Now, if you have a policy laid in such a way, and if you have how to kind of approach, how to kind of solutions, then it's going to be easy for having an integrated framework available for India to move on. Now, the other aspect is that in Indian system, and like many other countries, you have a system of accounting or assessing the impacts of any development before you authorize that project. And this is covered under the environmental impact assessment legislation in different countries. The framework stands to be most common for all these. This is a kind of a globally accepted framework where you have screening, scoping, assessment, evaluation, and decisions. Now, what I'm trying to say here is there is a tweaking needed in different stages of EIF framework to account for natural capital. At the screening stage, we talk about
Sorry, Dr. Asha, if I can please interrupt you, if you can please wrap up in the next 2-3 minutes.
Yeah, I will do that. I will certainly do that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so in these cases, we look at which project has a higher potential to impact, and those are considered in screening. But here, the natural capital aspect is not considered, and that's never accounted. So here I'm suggesting that when we are screening for such projects, we also should look at which of these projects will have a major compromise for natural capital. Then scoping, we should be able to prioritize which of these services need to be considered and what are the dependencies on these ecosystem services and how do they get affected in case the project comes up. Assessment, we all know we talk about water quality, we talk about air quality, we talk about species, habitats which are going to be impacted. But here, my thrust is also on including the natural capital assets as a part of the baseline. These should also be accounted for. And when we talk about valuation, we are talking about capturing the value of these natural capital within the valuation. And that makes the decisions easy because then the decision maker can use this relevant information to understand what are the trade-offs and whether such projects are acceptable or they should not be taken or approved. Now, there's a strong policy support which is needed. The least regret options need to be always worked out. We don't want to align roads that lead to disrupt corridors, or we don't want to have designs for passages which are not sensitive to animals. So least regrets will only happen if you have a strong policy, and this is backed by good research to say that what works and what fails, and always trying to encourage no net loss. Our effort should be such to see that the natural capital is maintained. If we cannot enhance it, at least we see that we do not lose it. And my last, most important recommendation, which has been always there, but I'm finding it really frustrating because strategic planning in India is not moving. Well, this is the need of the day, because if you have several linear projects coming in the same landscape, then you don't want to work in silos to create these assessments, but find out which is the land which is going to be compromised. And we must prioritize the no-go areas based on the combined development or regional planning in a particular state. All this definitely requires synergies, which is a big challenge. The ministries have to talk to each other, and this seldom happens. But we are not going to give up hope and see that how best we can mainstream the natural capital and planning of the transportation sector. Thank you. I think that's what I had to say, and I'm now ready for questions if there are any.
Thank you, Dr. Asha. Thank you so much. I think we have learned a lot of new, valuable information from your presentation. The habitat services, I think that's definitely something that we need to pay more attention to, and the road verges. So that's really interesting. I must confess, though, I have been working in the transport sector for a long time, and I'm aware that this is important. But then the way you presented it in terms of real biodiversity value and the example that you showed of that road case study in India with the 60 meter and 30 meter, that's really interesting. So I'm just seeing if we have any questions. I don't think we have any questions yet from the audience, Dr. Asha, but since, just to, if I can indulge you, if we could go back to the slide with the road with the 60 meter and 30 meter right of way. And I was just curious, it's a bit ironic that when the road right of way is wider, it seems it's better because then the verges, exactly, that's this slide. So it seems that the road version on top with the wider road of way, right of way, 60 meter, that's actually better. Because if you follow the narrower road with only 30 meter right of way, then it seems that the verge gets ignored. So in a way, does this mean that because there is this allowance for, turfing and plantation on the side of the road, so that's why it's better?
No, what I'm trying to say here, Karma, that in the initial proposal, you had a road verge 30 meters, right of way 60 meters. So out of 60 meters, you have 30 meters for road, and the rest of it was for the verge. So 30 meters verge is quite good to have it as a kind of a distinct land between the roadway and the forest. And the animals use this. Then we know that these have special values. They are more open areas. Certain animals like staying there, and when they cross over, they have a fairly good idea when to cross and not get killed. Now, so the next slide also explains why verges are important, because of the different services, including the thermal regulation for many species which don't sit on the road but use these areas because it's more lighted, it's more open. Now, so if we understand the value of verge, then we would not sacrifice this. And so in the next proposal, when the revision came in, they said, okay, let's have a right of way of 30 meters instead of the earlier 60 meters. So which essentially meant that they're compromising on this area which should have been maintained as a verge. So because the engineers didn't understand the value of verge, they readily agreed, okay, we'll reduce the forest diversion area, the area that we need, by about 30 meters. But which is a wrong practice, and it's more flowing from the ignorance of the importance of the verges. So we did not yield to it. They said you'll have to maintain the verge in any case.
Mm-hmm. I see. Got it. Yes. So this really, I mean, fascinating to see the importance of the verge. So to all our participants, and I think some are our ADB colleagues, please note that we need to pay more attention to the road verges. So I think we have one or two questions from Mr. Chandan Kumar. I'm not sure, is it probably a comment? Research areas on road transport to mitigate wildlife. Perhaps, Mr. Chandan Kumar, could I invite you to ask your question or provide your comment?
Very good morning, madam. Our intent is to do the research on the transport sector, how to mitigate the wildlife by doing research in the transport sector.
Well, we would need a whole day to look into the methodology of how to do an assessment of the road for impacts on wildlife. This is very well laid in different documentation, but the most important part is you should be aware about what values the area hold presently before you're talking about any development, and what is going to be compromised, and whether you are willing to let that go. If you are willing to let that go, then you work on mitigation, how to reduce the damage. And if it's a very critical area, then you would think of an alternative sites or alternative routes to such development. So a good research would mean that you highlight the impacts on different parameters, different ecosystem components, the services, the natural capital, and look at the welfare aspects for both species of plants and animals.
Thank you, Dr. Asha. Yes, I hope that gave you some idea, Mr. Chandan Kumar. But yeah, this is like Dr. Asha said, if we would need all day and maybe a couple of days to discuss. It's really a vast topic in terms of identifying the correct mitigation measures. So if you have further questions, please feel free to email us, the workshop, the organizers, and we'll be happy to provide more information to you. We better move on. We do have another question, but I think we need to move on to our next speaker in the interest of time, and then we will continue with the Q&A after Liz's presentation. So Liz, can I please invite you to make your presentation?
Yes, thank you, Karma. Let me just get my screen shared here. Okay, well, Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me on this webinar series. I'm going to be presenting on some of the exciting green infrastructure developments happening in the US over the past few years, and how science, policy, and practice intersect to help achieve green infrastructure goals, particularly related to roads. So many of the other speakers in the webinar series have discussed the issue at hand. Linear infrastructure has many direct and indirect impacts on wildlife and ecosystems, and major infrastructure projects are making their way into some of the last intact biodiversity hotspots left on the planet, with an estimated 25 million lane kilometers of new roads estimated by 2050. So how can we address this issue in a responsible and equitable way? So the goal here is to achieve balance. Infrastructure development can deliver major socioeconomic benefits, but it can also result in serious negative impacts on nature and in turn on people. But with careful planning, design, implementation, and policies, some of the negative impacts can be avoided, minimized, or mitigated. So there's many challenges to implementing green infrastructure. For one, wildlife movement and habitat connectivity is a transboundary issue, with many different management authorities and stakeholders needing to be involved. Often we find there's competing agency missions, priorities, and cultures, lack of capacity specific to the issue, lack of dedicated funding streams, and complex needs in terms of data, land security, community support, and funding. And we generally take an opportunistic approach with these projects rather than doing systematic planning. So to overcome the many challenges of working to build green infrastructure, we need to take a collaborative interdisciplinary approach to bring in expertise from a broad variety of fields, which often have little overlap. To do so, we need to build strong partnerships and work together to align science, policy, and practice, and to have these pieces be constantly feeding back into one another in an iterative, adaptive way. Science can build public support and understanding for the issue at hand. It can also educate lawmakers and decision makers, and with pressure from their constituents can give policymakers the support they need to develop effective policy and funding solutions. These policy actions and funds can then feed back into both science and on-the-ground actions. So we need lots of types of information to really decide where to invest in green infrastructure. I know we've covered connectivity mapping in one of the previous webinars, but here are just some of the things that we need to be looking at. Habitat and connectivity data. So where are our core habitats and where are the most intact connections between them? And those are going to be the most important places to avoid or mitigate the impacts. Biodiversity data. So what species do we have and where are our species of conservation concern? Wildlife movement data. So where are wildlife moving across the landscape and likely to be impacted by infrastructure, and how might that shift with climate change? Infrastructure data. So where does it exist now and where is it planned for the future and what types of infrastructure? And then conflict data. Where do we have wildlife vehicle collisions happening, wildlife mortality, and barrier effects happening from roads? So I'd like to just share a story of one way that science has evoked real change in the US. This example comes from the area surrounding Yellowstone National Park in the Western US. Yellowstone is known for its wildlife and brings in over 4 million visitors each year. And this tourism is the major economic driver of local economies throughout much of the region. About 10 years ago now, a group called the Wyoming Migration Initiative, which was started by scientists based out of the University of Wyoming, began a huge public education campaign using GPS collar data of iconic wildlife species. They created maps and used social media and other sources to get the word out that Yellowstone's beloved wildlife really relied on a habitat much bigger than just the park. And we're getting into all kinds of conflicts with roads and other development along their migration routes. By telling the story of wildlife movements in and around Yellowstone National Park through maps and storytelling, the Migration Initiative was able to educate and allow the public to see with their own eyes that the park alone was not enough to sustain the wildlife populations that it's famous for. By doing this storytelling, they built huge public support, both locally and across the country, for protecting migration routes and wildlife corridors. Initiatives like the Wyoming Migration Initiative started what became a national conversation in the US about the urgent need to address habitat connectivity issues and to protect wildlife corridors, especially where they intersect with roads, as these are often the most visible impacts. So, to begin building on the momentum of this national conversation about habitat connectivity, wildlife corridors, and road ecology, groups of NGOs, researchers, and others began doing outreach to policymakers at both the state and federal level to figure out how they could begin to address this issue through policy action. A coalition of organizations, including mine, put together a toolkit for state legislators outlining the issues, the need, cost-effective solutions, and potential opportunities for legislation. The toolkit provided information on a broad range of subjects, including data, planning, conservation practice, private land incentives, partnerships, and funding. So, due in part to science-based outreach and education campaigns and broad public support, legislators actually began to move forward with actions that wouldn't have even been considered a few years before. In the past few years, state legislatures across the nation have been pursuing habitat connectivity legislation. In addition, governors have been enacting in executive orders, and even states who haven't gone the policy route have been doing things like interagency agreements and having the state wildlife and natural resource agencies actually start talking to each other and working together. That had been one of the biggest difficulties in working on wildlife crossing and green infrastructure projects. Basically, transportation agencies saying, you know, we do transportation, we don't do wildlife, and wildlife and natural resource agencies saying the same thing. You know, we do habitat, we do wildlife, we don't do transportation. So really, there was this communication breakdown and lack of good working relationships. So you can see the map here, some of the places where connectivity legislation at the state level has been introduced and enacted, or where executive orders exist. The primary objectives of these policies are, again, to get the state agencies responsible for transportation and natural resources to begin working together and communicating. Some of the policies include formal interagency agreements, and most call for statewide wildlife corridor mapping and identification of priority locations to invest in green infrastructure to improve safety for people and wildlife while improving habitat connectivity. So now you can see we've gone from science to policy and back to science and implementing best practices on the ground. So again, over the last, I guess, almost a decade now, there's been a bunch of groups working together with lawmakers to develop policies for habitat connectivity at the federal level, providing data and information to lawmakers to help influence the transportation bill to include provisions for habitat connectivity and wildlife conservation. Finally, in November of 2021, the Infrastructure and Jobs Act was signed into law. It's now called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Most excitingly, this new law provides $350 million in dedicated funding for wildlife crossings through a pilot program, as well as numerous other fish and wildlife provisions to improve habitat connectivity. So the wildlife crossing pilot program is the $350 million pilot program to encourage states to adopt measures to reduce wildlife vehicle collisions and improve habitat connectivity for terrestrial and aquatic species. This will be administered through a federal competitive grant program over the course of 5 years, and at least 60% of the grant funding will go towards projects in rural areas. So the evaluation criteria for the wildlife crossing project pilot program includes projects, the extent to which proposed projects are likely to protect motorists and wildlife by reducing the number of wildlife vehicle collisions and improving habitat connectivity for aquatic and terrestrial species. Additionally, it encourages non-federal contributions, supports local economic development, incorporates innovative technologies, provides opportunities for education and outreach, and includes monitoring and evaluation criteria, as well as any other relevant criteria determined by the Department of Transportation. In addition to the Wildlife Crossing pilot program, the U.S. Department of Transportation will develop an updated wildlife vehicle collision reduction study, including a report to Congress and best practices manual, and create a series of workforce development and training courses for transportation and wildlife professionals based on wildlife vehicle collisions. We'll also develop a standardized methodology for collecting and reporting wildlife collision and carcass data and provide a template to help states voluntarily implement that guidance. It'll establish guidance that includes a threshold to determine whether a highway should be evaluated for potential projects to reduce wildlife vehicle collisions and improve habitat connectivity. And it will determine if upgrades to bridges and tunnels should include measures to improve habitat connectivity and train inspectors to assess aquatic and terrestrial passage. In addition, there's lots of other funding opportunities available in some of the existing federal programs, including $20 million per year for projects to reduce wildlife vehicle collisions on federal public lands while maintaining terrestrial and aquatic connectivity. Wildlife crossing projects are eligible for funding under 3 other major transportation funding programs that will distribute billions of dollars over the next 5 years. And that includes projects that improve aquatic connectivity as well, and projects to enhance pollinator-friendly habitat, including planting native vegetation, that will get a total of $10 million over the next 5 years. So lots of exciting opportunities for funding green infrastructure in the US. So my organization has created a toolkit for developing successful projects under this Wildlife Crossing pilot program. In addition, this resource provides guidance for designing projects in accordance with the grant application criteria and identifies best practices, key resources, and examples of successful research projects and partnerships. So finally, I'd like to wrap up my presentation here with a brief plug for a project that some of my colleagues at the center have been working on over the past year. It's called Building a Foundation for Linear Infrastructure Safeguards in Asia. This assessment was funded by USAID and examines 28 Asian countries where USAID operates, and includes an in-depth analysis in 5 countries. It's focused on roads, rails, and power lines. And the overall goal was to understand the current state of knowledge and develop initial training materials to safeguard wildlife from linear infrastructure development. My colleague, Rob Ament, will be giving you a more in-depth look at this project during the next webinar series, but I just wanted to kind of give a brief overview of it right now. And with that, I am just going to wrap up and ask if there's any questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Liz. And thank you for, I think you delivered your presentation in less than 20 minutes. So that's great. We've gained some time. Very inspiring, all these initiatives in the US with the Wyoming Migration Initiative and the habitat connectivity legislation. So this is all very inspiring. And we in Asia, we need to learn from this and try to apply them. So we should quickly move to the Q&A because we have a lot of questions lined up. And before we ask a question to you, Liz, if you could please go back to Dr. Asha and continue the conversation about the verges. So I think we still have some leftover questions and some new questions, and then maybe we'll pick up some questions for you, Liz. So Dr. Asha, oh yes, I see you, your video is on. So just to go back to the point on verges, there's a lot of interest. So a very genuine point that was raised by Mr. Sam Pandula, how can we address this in the case of rural roads where land is rare and a luxury? So in the context of rural roads where the road is small and there is very limited land available. So I think his point is then how do we find the land to create the verge?
Okay, I think in the context of rural verges, it's not so important to have the verges as we are talking about in case of highways and large infrastructure projects, because these roads are not so wide And in case of rural areas, they definitely don't run through the wilderness areas where the importance of verges is still higher.
I see. Okay, great. I think that's a very, very good practical answer. So next question, this is from my colleague Kai. And for roads with limited right-of-way adjacent to forest area, is it preferable to clear the forest to create the verge or just have it as a forest?
That's interesting. In any case, you will end up clearing some of it when you are constructing a road. So what I'm suggesting is to minimize on the physical disturbance and let nature take its course on the area, on the land which is just adjacent to the road. So it may not be a strict verge, but over the years, it will pick up the functions of a verge. And not necessarily the next adjacent land use will be a forest ecosystem. It could be a grassland ecosystem. It could be a shrubland. So what road does is create more impacts on that. And if you guard some of the forest area and protect it and not get physically disturbed, it will help enhance the values of that forest as well, or that particular ecosystem or land use as well.
Mm-hmm. Right. Thank you. Yeah, that's right. I think it's naturally in most cases there is this maintenance works which anyway go on either side of the road for purposes of road safety and things like that, and vegetation.
Also aesthetics. If you see the European verges, there it's more for aesthetics that the verges are being managed, which not necessarily is a good practice. One has to look at the regimes, which areas to be mowed, which have to be left natural, what functions are the, and it again boils down to that same logic, Karma, that we need to have a good understanding of the value of verge in each individual project. Only then we will be able to identify or prioritize the need to protect it.
Absolutely. So the context is key. And we are almost hitting 12 o'clock, but I think it's okay, at least for us, the resource persons, to continue this and extend it by a couple more minutes, by another 10 to 15 minutes. This is for the information of our audience, since we know there are a lot of questions and we need to try to address as many as we can. And another question again on the verge, and then I think let's keep that as the last question on the verge and we move to another point. This is from Mr. Shailesh Desai. And interesting question. He's saying, has the verge influenced road mortality to the natural verge versus, I think, created verge? So is there any data or I guess impact on mortality of wildlife with and without a proper verge?
I think there are a lot of examples which suggest the value of the verge is in providing a kind of a movement corridor. And for sensitive species, that piece of land becomes important. For shy species, that piece of land becomes important so that the animal doesn't get onto the road directly. Or if it has to go, it allows it a time for decision making. So whether it's a natural verge or a created verge is not so important as long as it meets the functions for the specific species that we're talking about, for animals that we're talking about crossing and getting onto the road. Mm-hmm. And most verges are natural. When you clear a road, what you do is, if it's through a forest, you clear it and leave some areas just adjacent to it, which have some physical disturbance, but over time, the resilience takes over and they sort of maintain the natural integrity and the processes and the functions which nature needs to maintain. So it's not that important an aspect whether it's artificially created or naturally maintained. But yes, the preference will always be to maintain the natural section of the stretch to serve as a verge.
Mm-hmm. Right. Priority for the natural section. Thank you. There is a question, it's actually meant for Dr. Asha, but I think maybe we can ask Liz's views since, Center for Large Landscapes and you're looking at large scale connectivity. This is a question from Mr. Majumdar. For free movement of animals, it may be better to construct animal overpasses instead. This offers greater safety and comfort to wildlife. Without human interference. What is your view? So maybe we can hear from Liz first on this point, and then after that, Dr. Asha.
Is the question, is it better to build overpasses for wildlife as opposed to what is the alternative?
I think as opposed to either underpasses or the point about the verge, to have the wildlife cross the road as a verge, as opposed to that, and in comparison to underpass. So I'm assuming that's the context. Yes.
Okay, gotcha. Well, I mean, there's a lot of research that's been done on different species preferences. So just in terms of overpasses and underpasses, the type of structure and the dimensions and design criteria really depend on the type of landscape that you're in and the type of species that you're dealing with. So some types of animals prefer to have open structures, large bridges or overpasses, where others kind of like to have cover and go through smaller structures, underpasses, culverts, things like that. So but definitely in terms of reducing wildlife vehicle collisions and providing habitat connectivity, having crossing structures is better if we're talking about roads that have lots of lanes or high traffic volumes. And even if you have verges on the side, there might not be a lot of opportunities for animals to be able to safely cross the road. So again, it comes down to these different, if you have a 2-lane rural highway that has very low traffic volumes, then you might not need grade separated crossings. But if we're talking about large highways with high traffic volumes, then really to have animals cross safely and frequently for habitat connectivity, you need to have those grade separated crossings.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Liz. Dr. Asha, your views?
Yeah, I think first thing I would want to emphasize very clearly is that connectivity conservation lays stress on facilitating movement of animals. And that's the way we need to work on what species requires, how sensitive we are to needs. So underpasses, overpasses, ducts, or overhead bridges for connecting terrestrial species, and also canopy bridges, those are important. The verges provide the benefits to species to use it randomly. But if we want dedicated passages, if we know where the crossing zones are, we definitely need to facilitate movement through properly designed and aligned structures. And when the carriageway is too wide, the road verge will not serve its purpose, because once the animal gets onto the road, crossing that very wide road may not be possible. It may not be able to negotiate. So the verges don't have value there. We definitely need dedicated structures.
Yes, thank you, Asha, and thanks for pointing that out, that actually verge will be important only in certain types of roads. If it's a large expressway, 6-lane, then of course it'll have no value. Then for sure.
And that's only one of the functions of the verge. The verge offers other functions which also need to be looked into, as carbon sinks, or as places where pollinators move to adjacent areas, or for predators to then kill pests. So those are other functions that we cannot omit or forget.
Right. There are the other, natural environmental benefits in addition
to the wider services which the verge offers.
Right. Okay, thank you. So, okay, a question for Liz. How to ensure that animals can follow the guideline to walk through design tunnels and bridges for their daily routine? If there is any design or other measures. So I guess basically the question is, how can we ensure that the wildlife will use these underpasses or overpasses, these structures that have been constructed? Over to you,
Yeah,
Liz.
that's a great question. And a lot of that really comes down to planning ahead of time. So when we're going to invest in things like wildlife crossing structures and fencing, we need to understand where animals are moving across the landscape already and make sure that we're connecting areas that have important habitat, and ideally using things like GPS collar data or wildlife tracking so that we can site wildlife crossings in the best locations. There's other tools to help guide wildlife to safe crossing opportunities. So typically when we're talking about wildlife crossings, we're not just talking about overpasses and underpasses, we're also talking about fences and other types of measures that guide animals towards those safe crossing opportunities. So there's lots of different ways, but mostly it comes down to only investing in structures like that in places where we already know wildlife are trying to cross the road to get to important habitat.
Right. Thank you. And just a follow up to that, which is related to that point, a very interesting question from Donald Sinclair. Wouldn't it be better if we dug tunnels and learned to drive in the dark, then build animal overpass, taking the easy flat drive for us? So basically, yeah, rather than going through all this trouble, why not if we dig tunnel for people to drive through and then have the wildlife to use the land on top? So then we don't have to deal with training or the wildlife figuring out that they need to use the wildlife overpass. Liz?
It's an interesting proposal for sure. I wonder how much more expensive it would be to build this extensive tunnel network. I don't know, but it would certainly be a lot better for wildlife. So.
Yes, I think only in, we've talked about wildlife underpass and wildlife overpass. That's true. It's very interesting because we are looking to keep it should be like underpass below the ground level for human beings instead of for wildlife. So it's a very interesting view. And I guess, I mean, if it's absolutely necessary in some really very high biodiversity spots with, critically endangered species, perhaps that could be an option. Of course, it'll be very, very expensive, but then we would need to really weigh the importance. If it's like, a critically endangered species that is really going to die if we don't take this measure, then perhaps it'll be worth it. So that's a very interesting question. I see a couple of hands up. Dr. Mathur, I see that you're here. Hello, good morning. And I see your hand is up. Do you have a question?
Thank you, Karma. I don't exactly have a question, but I have an observation.
Yes, please share your observation.
About looking at road-induced transportation issues.
You're breaking up, Dr. Mathur.
And
perhaps
so on and
you
so
could
forth.
turn off your video.
Okay.
Maybe that will help if you spoke with your video off.
Yeah. So I was saying that our foray into transportation ecology is about 3 decades old. Then about 2 decades back, we were introduced a term called road ecology. And I'm referring to Dr. Foreman and others who chipped in and provided that. And a few years from then came the rail ecology. And now today's discussion, and with Dr. Asha's intervention, I think it's a time to then coin in verge ecology, because a whole range of questions are now being raised, and this attention of the entire transportation community has been drawn in by her. And I think this area also needs further investments of time and research, because the kind of questions which were asked are verges in rural landscape vis-a-vis verges in urban landscape in 2 ways and 4 ways and 6 ways. So I think it's a very important area where we can initiate some studies and some analysis. So that was my first point. And second point is again related, and thank you, Liz, for presenting some very interesting updates from United States and the way your states are also making state-specific provisions, which is quite good. If I compare to India, fortunately, the federal ministry has an overwhelming influence. So the national highways and the Indian railways can issue directive, which are then to be followed by everyone. So, but I see the merit that things can vary in provinces, things can vary in states, and therefore if there are some state-specific regulations, and we would definitely like to have a look at them and see that when we revise our policy, we must have the best of input of things happening in United States or Canada or wherever. I want to now move to a little more specific thing. See, all these years, the entire transportation community, the road rail ecology community, was trying to sensitize that underpasses and overpasses are needed. It took all these years to convince them. And again, I say from Indian perspective, now we have very good examples of underpasses and overpasses constructed. But unlike the United States, we in India feel that while the crossing over structures are being made, there are a lot more things which need to be done in and around these structures. I'm now referring to whatever you will call cosmetics of the structure, the aesthetics of the structure, or the landscape architecting of these structures. Because the actual arrival and departure of an animal will depend also on the immediate vicinity of what is happening around that structure. So right now we have not paid that attention, but I'm sure now as we move along, we should also devote some time that what color should be used, what material should be used, and how other kinds of excesses have to be controlled. See, we want the animals to be guided over there. And for that guidance, we might need some more inputs. And I'm only opening because there are a lot of researchers who are also listening to us, who can take up some ideas that how do you improve the overall approach to these structures. So I'll stop here. These are some future areas of work. But thank you, Karma, for bringing to super wildlife and transport professionals this morning. It's an all-women webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Mathur. Yes, women power. We have also Dr. Bilal. I think your hand is up. If you can please give your comment or question, yes. And then I would like to invite my colleagues.
Thanks, Karma, for nicely conducting, and Liz and Dr. Asha Rajvanshi for very nice presentation. So just two very fast comments. One is, there was a very interesting question. Can we construct tunnels for humans so that we can go and animals have an easy passage? Yes, it looks very nice, but what we used to say that conservation has to be sustainable and it has to be affordable. And the transportation challenges are more in developing countries than in developed countries. So if we go for like tunnels for the humans, it's 10 times more costlier than the normal infrastructure. So we can construct probably mitigation measures at 10 different places by just constructing a tunnel at one place. Probably we may cover much larger landscape. So if we probably think in that particular way, that particular direction, probably we may solve a problem at a much larger landscape than spending a lot of money at just at one place. So probably much larger landscape will be connected for wildlife. So that's a one important aspect. And the other one is, there was a very interesting discussion on road verges. Yes, road verges are very important, very critical in terms of a carbon sinks, in terms of providing the immediate use. But there was a very interesting question from one of the ADB staff regarding, do we need to clear these the forest part of it and then go to the next? Yes. Because in terms of road safety, you have to clear some part of the forest. Because if you will not clear some part of the forest, then whether road verge is 30 meter or 60 meter, because it's connected on the forest. So then it's not only the 60 meter, it goes continuously with the forest. It can be 100 meter, 200 meter, 30 meter. So this first part of 30 meter has to be cleared, because that gives the opportunity both to the animals and to the drivers to see each other. So if you don't clear that road verge of the 30 meters, then both the drivers and the animals, they are head on with each other. So which is going to enhance the collision rate between the humans and the wildlife. So that's why it's very important to clear that first part of it, and rest it's continuous. So after 30 meter, it is continuous with the forest. So it can go 2 kilometers, 5 kilometers, 10 meters. So that first 30 meters is very critical, both for the safety of animals and for the safety of the humans also. So yes, it's a very interesting. There are a lot of papers coming now which talk about the road verge, and as Dr. Mathur has likely said, so it's a time to drive in a new field of ecology, probably the road verge ecology, and which may give you a lot of interesting answers in future. So very, very nicely conducted. Thank you so much. Now I hand over back to you for.
Thank you, Dr. Bilal. Yes, that's an important point. So it's important for the wildlife as well as for the human beings. And before we are nearing the end, we've already gone over time, but then since it seems to be a very popular webinar series, we always get a lot of questions. So I think it's okay to extend the time since the topic is very important. Suva, are you there? Can I invite you to ask a question on the different zones in the protected areas? Are you there, Suva?
Yeah, hi, Karma.
Hi, Suva. Please, yeah, go ahead, ask your question.
No, so basically because while Dr. Asha was actually presenting the slides again on the verge, this is again a question related to the verge aspect. So my only point is that because she mentioned that the verge typically have a higher biodiversity value component. So in that case, whenever we are talking about any protected area, we already have predefined core and buffer zones. So in terms of a linear transportation project, or say even in terms of a metro projects, however, for metro projects, we don't have any regulatory process in India. But then when we are defining the core and buffer zones, how do we define it with respect to the verge aspect then? And secondly, in terms of the Pench Tiger Reserve project, I happened to visit it once and I realized that it was an elevated corridor and majority of the road is an elevated expressway, which is why we have the animal underpasses. So in that case, are we saying that the complete verge aspect is gone? And as Dr. Bilal Habib also said that some part of it we still need to clear. But then the point that I'm trying to raise is how do we differentiate, first of all, between the core and buffer zones if we consider the verge aspect? And secondly, how do we retain the biodiversity value then? Because we are anyways disturbing the biodiversity value also, right? So how do we, because in any road project, we will anyways have the impact on the verge aspects, and creating animal underpasses will also involve some kind of disturbance. So how do we say that underpasses will also help or overpasses will help? Because the verge will anyways get impacted, the biodiversity value will get impacted. So that was my question actually. I'm not sure if the question is correct or not, but it just your presentation just triggered this thought.
Dr. Asha, your views very quickly, please.
I'll make an effort to answer that question. Now, first, I never said that the verges have higher biodiversity. What I said, it can have a different biodiversity value. Because these are open areas, sometimes you get species which are more in ecotonal or edge areas, which you see them here, you don't see them inside. And then these areas are open areas as compared to interior forests, which are dense and which do not have enough light, and there could be difference in microclimates. So what I hinted is at for different kind of biodiversity. Now, again, drawing from what Bilal also said, I completely agree with what he said, that you need some area to be cleared. We're not talking about that area. We're talking about road, shoulder, and areas beyond it, which has to be cleared to prevent accidents and collisions. So that is not the real verge area. The real verge area is to provide a kind of a continuum of natural habitats beyond the carriageway, beyond the area, which is necessary to maintain the function of road, the operation smoothly. Now, underpasses and overpasses are dedicated structures located at places where we know that this is a definite crossing zone. So they cannot be compromised. There are species which are sensitive to moving in open areas. There are areas where you need to find passages facilitated. And so the road ecology or the rural ecology actually talks about what kind of species, what kind of designs, where they should be located. So that's all very well laid. There is no denial about that fact. You have to have that. The verges, as I said, you have to look at from other perspectives, other ecosystem services, not necessarily as a part of a protected area. And in any case, the road, if it's through the protected area, these verges become an integrated part of the buffer. But if they're falling outside, then we know the ecological functions being provided by these verges. So I don't think there is any confusion about it.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Asha. And there is one more question, but I'm afraid I need to get on with the closing. So Liz, can I request you, if you could please take a look at the question from Mr. Ali Kabir I think his question is what is the mitigation measure for a railway that is going between an elephant corridor? So would it be okay if you could please try to chat your, type your answer in the chat box to him, if that's okay?
Okay, I'll look for that question.
Thank you, Liz. So thank you so much. Look, it's a very interesting discussion, and I know we could keep talking for hours on this topic, but then we do need to close the session. And I think one thing is the point that was raised by Dr. Asha in the beginning is with regard to the natural capital. So I think this is something which is an area that we need to pay more attention to in transport projects. And I like how Dr. Asha had mentioned in the beginning, roads depend on ecosystem services. So I think this is something which is very key. The ecosystem services and the natural capital is very important for the sustainability of the road. And then on that basis, we should work towards improving the ecosystem services and natural capital within the road or rail line area. And the idea on the habitat services, which Dr. Asha had mentioned, is also very interesting. And I think that is actually something which somehow I feel now, looking at the typical lessons that we study in college and school about the provisioning services, regulatory, cultural, but this habitat services is very important. So it's great that this is now coming in. Road verges, we've talked a lot about it. So this is something where we need to pay more attention to. And then about the accounting of biodiversity. Of course, now this is quite challenging in terms of valuing ecosystem services and trying to put a value on biodiversity. This is a challenging area, but then as Dr. Asha mentioned, this is something which is being pursued, and actually India does have a document on this. So maybe Dr. Asha, we can request for you to share the link to the document. I understood that it's been disclosed publicly on the website somewhere. So maybe we could share that with our participants so that we get an idea on that. And then lastly, your point on the strategic planning, which is very, very important. And we need to prioritize the no-go zones. So that is absolutely key. So I think these are just a few takeaway points which I got from Dr. Asha's presentation. And from Liz, wonderful initiatives to learn about the Wyoming Migration Initiative and how they used maps and social media to raise awareness, you know, to get the public to support the creation of more area and to prevent negative impacts on wildlife. So that is a great story. And also to learn about the state-specific legislations. That's very, very inspiring. And it's, yeah, just a legislation only on habitat connectivity. That's great. That's fantastic. And I hope at some point in Asia in the next couple of years that we can also do something similar to that. And also all the funds, it's amazing, these big pots of money. I assume this is related to the current president, Joe Biden's, there was some trillion amount of dollar which was dedicated for infrastructure. I assume all of this is part of that initiative. So this is great. And there is a lot to learn from, lot for Asia to learn from all these good practices in the US. And we hope that we can actually start, doing something similar in the next couple of years, looking at it right from the public local support point of view, from the legislation point of view, and also from the financing point of view. And then you talked about also this partnership between the Transport Agency and the Wildlife Conservation Agency, where you said usually they don't talk to each other. So this is very interesting because this is the case in most Asian countries. And it's great that, you're able to bring them on the same table to talk to each other. And this is, I also feel that this is key, because very often a lot of the solutions are right there. It's just that they're not talking to each other. So those were a few takeaways which I got from the presentation from Dr. Asha and Liz. Thank you very much. Some excellent information that we received. And thank you to our participants for your very active participation as usual. I'm not sure, I think there may be a few questions which we could not address, but we will try to get back to you with our responses if there are any questions which have been left unaddressed. And Victor, if you could please show the slide on the 4 webinar series, just to remind everybody that today's webinar was the 3rd of a series of 4 webinars. And the last and final one will be held on 10th February. So please do stay tuned and sign up for this last final webinar, which will be on lessons from the field. So with that, I thank everybody for your time and interest. And again, to Liz and Dr. Asha, thank you for your excellent presentation and all the interventions from Dr. Mathur, Dr. Bilal, and all the participants. And especially to my colleagues, Isao, Victor, Cecile, Sharmista, all the people that are working in the background to put this webinar today. Okay, then, thank you so much for your time, and please stay safe. And I hope Omicron is not disrupting your lives too much. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Have a nice day.